Well, I'm Catherine Blaylock, and I'm a fish and wildlife biologist here at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'm speaking with Stuart Welsh, a passionate fish biologist and writer whose work brings the fascinating world of central Appalachian fishes to life. Welcome, Stuart. It's good to be talking with you today about the amazing dazzle of freshwater fish. What first sparked your fascination with fish? Was there a particular moment or an experience that set you on this career path?
I think it was my younger years. As a kid, I spent a lot of time in small creeks and, wading in the water and flipping rocks looking for crayfish and really any critter that I could catch. And so that early experience really, sparked my, later emphasis in wildlife and fish.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Beckley, West Virginia.
Okay, so perfect Appalachian region. You got mountains and streams, and that's awesome. Your work dives deep into the ecology and conservation of native fish. Why is it so crucial for us to understand these species, and especially those in the Appalachian region?
Well, I think when you look at the Appalachians, there's just a large number of different kinds of fishes, and so when you start looking at all these different fish, it's kind of fascinating to understand what they do and where they live and how they live. And I think there's a lot of people that are interested in that and fascinated with nature. And so I think it's a real interest for people to learn more about it. And one way that they can learn more about nature is through reading books and watching videos and shows about nature. And so that's kind of the main reason why I wrote my book on Central Appalachian fishes, was to put that information out there, give something that people could read and learn more about the natural resources. Yeah,
definitely. And the Appalachian region's like a biodiversity hotspot too. You've got a lot of, outside of just aquatic species too, you've got a lot of species moving through over the mountains. That's neat. So in your book, Hornyheads, Madtoms, and Darters, you cover a lot of really cool fish, and you give emphasis on charismatic species, non-natives, new discoveries even, and you talk about like predator-prey relationships. You did a fantastic job blending the peer-reviewed scientific literature with nature writing. So I really appreciated that. I had a fun time going through your chapters, and all the while you're talking about fish and their natural habitat. So can you share maybe one fish species that most people might be surprised to learn about?
Yeah, well, I think there's that's a hard choice because there's so many interesting and fascinating fishes that we do have. You know, one of my chapters was on the log perch, which I find to be a really fascinating type of darter. And the reason I emphasize the log perch is because it has such an interesting pattern of camouflage in terms of the pigmentation on its body. It kind of looks like it has zebra stripes. And of course, it's a smaller bodied fish, and so it's vulnerable to predators. But it, as many fish do, it uses its camouflage to as a way to reduce predation risk. And so in that chapter, I wrote about some of the interesting, different interesting camouflage patterns that's on the fish, not just the zebra stripes, but it has a nice dark spot at the base of the tail fin, which is referred to as an eye mimic, which is...
So it's mimicking the look of an eye?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so a lot of times predators will attack their prey head first, so they can kind of focus on the eyes of their prey. And so the idea there is that if the predator gets confused and thinks the tail end of the fish is the head, by that looking at the eye spot, that it may attack the fish from the tail first, and which would give it a better chance of escaping.
Yeah, definitely. That's tricky. That's awesome. Good pick. As I was reading, one of the things that you do while fishing is you drop an underwater camera down, and it's kind of genius. You get to see what's going on underwater while you're fishing at the water surface. What's one of the most unforgettable moments you've had while observing fish up close?
Yeah, I think with regard to the camera was the one story that I wrote about in the book on northern pike. And I was fishing with my son. We were ice fishing, and we had a camera down near the bottom, and that of course allows you to see your fishing lure, and it also allows you to see a fish when it approaches the lure. And in this particular case, the northern pike approached the lure, and it was the behavior of the pike was quite unusual. It took its pectoral fins, which are the fins on the sides of the body just behind the head. It took those fins and started in a rowing motion where the sediment on the bottom kind of came up like a plume or a cloud, and so it kind of embedded its body into that cloud of sediment, and then came up out of it to take the lure, and so it was a fascinating behavior. It kind of reminded me of a smoke screen, which is a common military maneuver, and so that's what I named the chapter "Smoke Screen Foraging," because it reminded me of that. But it was just an interesting behavior, because the way that the northern pike typically feeds is that it does.
And the northern pike is a predatory fish too.
It is a predator fish, and yeah, and so they typically feed by what's called a fast strike, where they get their body into kind of an S shape, and then they contract the muscles on both sides of their body in a way that it causes the fish to shoot forward really quickly so it can strike its prey at a very fast speed. That's the normal approach that they use for foraging, but in this case it did something completely different. And so I'm always fascinated when fishes do something unexpected, because you think after studying fish for a long time, you think you understand all their behaviors and what they do, and then by watching them you realize that there's always something new to learn about their behavior.
And you're talking about just like wildlife observation and the science, but that's just like a one-off observation, so it is kind of cool though. I'm glad that you tied that in. You'd mentioned darters earlier. That's one of the more charismatic species that's covered in the books. You discussed the hybridization between the candy darter and the variegated darter, and how the hybrid species also can reproduce. So what does that mean for the future of their fish diversity, and how does hybridization affect ecosystems at large?
Yeah, so hybridization happens typically, if you think about a species which has a distribution range, and if that distribution range represents its native range, often what you have is another species which has its own distribution range, but may be separate, gets moved into the range of the other species, and so it's referred to as an introduction event, or when that fish is moved, it's called a non-native species. And so sometimes you have a situation where you have closely related species, you have the native species, you have the non-native species that's been moved to the same location.
And in that case, the non-native is the variegated,
yes,
and the native is the candy darter.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And so in this example, you had the variegated darter being moved outside of its normal range into the range of the candy darter. Those two fish are closely related species. They were able to hybridize. They were able to spawn together. And so what happened is the variegates were spawning with the candy darters, and in some cases with hybrids you get sterile offspring. But in this case, was not true. And so the hybrids were able to spawn as well. And so you have what's called back crossing, and you get a blending of the genes between the two species. And what it means for the native fish is that that population is basically lost because it's not the same as it was. There's still genetics of the species there, but it's blended with the non-native, through the hybridization process. Yeah,
and now it's competing those fishes as well for resources. That's and true. Habitat and all those things too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. After reading your chapter on eelways, that might have been one of my favorites. I didn't know much about the American eel, but I was so impressed and found it a really remarkable species. In your book, you said no fish within Central Appalachia travels as far as the American eel. And you were talking about how they navigate upstream, upriver, and we have the Great Falls pretty close to us, a big section of waterfalls, and the American eel travels upstream, up the Great Falls. It's just like, wow, that's so cool. Can you share more about the American eel's unique life cycle and the challenges that they face as they navigate altered river systems?
Yeah, the American eel is a really fascinating fish, and there's a lot of mystery around it, a lot of unknowns, and of course through research efforts, people and myself have learned quite a bit through the years, but one of the interesting things about the eel is that it's catadromous, which means it spawns in the ocean. It actually spawns in an area of the Atlantic Ocean called the Sargasso Sea, and so the eel spawns there, and the larva form is kind of looks like a little willow leaf. It floats within the ocean currents and approaches the continental shelf, where it goes through a transformation. It turns into what looks more like an eel, but it's a very small eel, and it doesn't have any pigment, so it's clear, translucent, and it's referred to as a glass eel. And then the glass eels, as they grow, they develop pigment, and they're termed elvers. And those many of them start swimming up streams, river systems. And then when they get to, as they grow a little larger, they're then referred to as yellow eels. And those yellows, some of them go all the way up into the headwaters of our rivers.
And are they actually yellow? Do they turn a little bit yellow?
They do, yes.
Okay, okay.
And so they, depending on the latitude where you are in this region, the yellow eels may get to about 20 years old before they mature.
Wow.
And once they mature, they go through a process that's, of change where their muscle mass gets a little bigger. Sometimes their eyes get a little larger, and they turn a more silver pigment pattern. So they're called silver eels at that time. And then they are adults at that stage, and they're migrating back down to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. And so it's a really unique and unusual life cycle, one that involves marine and freshwater systems, and we're learning a lot about them through research, but there's always more to learn, and there's a lot of mystery involved with the eel because there's just so many unknowns. But it truly is a really fascinating fish that we have in our region.
Now, how do you track their movements upstream? So they're passing through eelways is what you called it. Mm-hmm. How are you able to track that?
So there's a number of impediments that the eels face when they're moving upstream. Dams, for example, they're trying to get around the dams, and there are some fish ladders that have been built on dams that are specific for eels, and they're called eelways.
Which help them move past the dams.
It allows them to climb up and over top of the dams.
Very cool.
And so I've been studying some eelways on the Shenandoah River for over 20 years now, and so what we do is we want to know, the numbers of eels that are using the ladder, that are swimming upstream, and also, we've gotten information on the timing of passage, because they are typically nocturnal, so they're passing through often at nighttime.
Nice.
But we have data, to suggest that there's different peaks in terms of like dusk and dawn and in the middle of the night and that sort of thing. So we've got information on that, and also the timing of the year. Like most fishes, they tend to slow down a little bit in colder waters, most of our freshwater fishes in this region, and so they don't do much movement in the winter time, but in the springtime they start moving upstream, and they move through fall, and like I said, many of them go extremely far distances upstream into headwaters. Yeah,
that's neat. I recall there were conservation measures that were taking place to help open up dam passages to let them move at night more easily. I'm not sure if I'm recalling that correctly, but anyway, that's just really interesting stuff. So one of the concepts that you talked about was watching and wondering, just simply observing nature, and there's a lot that nature can teach us just by watching. And to understand wildlife and experiencing nature this way, especially during childhood, it can shape the decisions we make later in life. How can the general public tap into that same sense of curiosity and deepen their connection with nature?
Well, I think the best way for people to learn about nature is to get outside and go to, in the case of fishes and streams, to go visit a headwater stream and just sit on a rock and enjoy the scene, because there's just a real nature experience associated with headwater streams, and it's about the senses, and it's what I call the song of the stream, that soft gurgling sound of the water running over the rocks, and it's also the touch of the moist moss on the rocks, and that part. But then the smells of nature, with being on a headwater stream, with the smell of the hemlock trees and the water, and all those senses, they play together to just make for a really nice nature experience. And of course, from my perspective, I like knowing that there are fishes swimming around in the stream as well, and trying to learn a bit about those as well. So I think that's the best way, is to get out and experience nature. But I also think that there's value in reading books and learning about nature. Definitely. In that way. There's a lot of fantastic nature writers out there currently and in the past, and there's a lot of books available where you can read about nature and learn quite a bit that way.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I was just getting more calm as you're describing the moss in the water. How do you, so when you're there in nature, how do you read a stream or read a river, for just with your understanding as a fish biologist, your education, your training? So when you look at a stream, what do you see?
Well, it depends on where I am in the stream. If I'm in a headwater stream, it's usually a fairly small stream, and what you look at is basically the water and the rocks and the stream banks, and it's not just about the stream itself, but it's also the surrounding landscape. And so, the area along the stream, which is often referred to by scientists as the riparian area, but it's all connected. It's what's important. It's not just about the stream, but it's about the landscape and the watershed, and that connectivity among those. And so I look at all of that, and that's where I get my best enjoyment of nature, is just kind of trying to understand how these things connect together and how they
fit into the bigger picture.
Yes,
definitely.
And of course, from my interest in fishes, I'm often wondering how all these things influence the fishes that are living in the streams.
Thank you. That's great. So it's definitely clear you're passionate about fish and sharing your knowledge with others. Your stories have highlighted a fascinating range of fish species, and a lot of the fun facts kind of bring to life the lesser known fishes. So the title of our podcast is Future of Conservation, and with a few closing questions as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, so your work emphasizes both the beauty and the complexities of aquatic ecosystems. For someone looking to get involved in conservation or fisheries science, what advice would you give for them to foster that same appreciation?
Well, I think you have to look at the educational requirements. There's a lot of people that love to just get out and enjoy nature, and I do that, and that's important. But if you're going to make a career out of it, you really need to go to college, get your undergraduate degree in some sort of environmental or natural resource field. And typically most people would go on to get a master's degree, so it's further graduate education, but it's typically necessary in this field to have further education. And so there's a huge educational requirement involved, but I think most people that are really passionate about nature and want to pursue that are more than willing to put the time in, for the educational component to get their degrees and therefore be more marketable in the job, for a job when they get out. So
yeah, does a potential employer look at things like field experience and research, or working alongside a professor in a lab setting, that sort of thing?
Yeah, of course, it depends on the job that's being offered, but I think that a lot of people do want to see, a lot of employers want to see field experience. They also want to see lab experience, and it's not, and it's more than just collecting data, but it's also about documenting the data in terms of writing reports and papers and so forth on it, and publishing papers and that sort of thing. So there's a lot involved, but I think that's an important part, because if you're going to spend a lot of time doing the work, then it's important to share it with other people, and one way to share that is through writing and reporting on what you find. Mm-hmm.
That's cool. So as an adjunct professor at West Virginia University, you've worked alongside a lot of graduate students. We were talking about that earlier. What do you hope that they take away from their research, especially when it comes to the future of fish conservation?
Yeah, I think in terms of graduate students, I try to emphasize the importance of having a broad knowledge about ecology and aquatic systems, but in many cases a student may specialize in a certain area, but I still think it's quite important to have a broader knowledge of what's going on, just so that you can kind of tie things together. And I think, so I emphasize the field work and collecting data, but I also emphasize sharing that data with others and being able to be a good writer, to be able to present data in a way that is available for other people to use. Yeah,
and your book does a good job of that, because a lot of times scientists are publishing regularly peer-reviewed scientific literature, and that doesn't always translate well to the general public. It doesn't always capture their attention, but you've done a really good job kind of bringing in both the nature writing in a way that anyone can understand it, biologist or not. So that's very important, especially in the field of sciences. So one last question. What is one fish species or river system that you would encourage people to learn more about?
Ooh, that's a tough question again. There's so many interesting fishes and so many interesting systems, river systems available. I think that it depends on the region where you are. There's but from my area of Central Appalachia, I'm really fascinated with river systems that have a diversity of fishes, that have a lot of different kinds of fishes. And one of the ones that is really special to me is the Elk River drainage, which is in West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And it is a a relatively large drainage, but it has a large number of fishes, over 100 different species of fishes.
Wow.
And so, you know, about 21 species of darters. And so I've done a lot of work there, you know, studying the fishes and the habitats, and so that's been a fascinating system for me to work in.
Very cool. So now we all need to learn about the Elk River drainage. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our listeners. Be sure to check out Stuart's book, Hornyheads, Madtoms, and Darters, to dive even deeper. Thank you.
Thanks.